When I ran my computer repair business, the number one thing people came in for was a slow PC. And 9 times out of 10, the fix was the same. It was to clone their old hard drive to an SSD. Now, I used to charge for this, but today I'm going to show you how you can do it yourself completely for free. And the method I'm going to show you in this video can be used to clone any disk to another disk. It doesn't have to be a hard drive to an SSD. It can be a normal SSD to another SSD. Maybe you've got a small SSD right now and you want to clone that to a larger SSD. You can use the exact same method I'm going to show you in this video to do that too. So let's get started. By the way, if you're looking to secure your connection, I personally use Proton VPN. They have an actual free tier with unlimited bandwidth and no logs, which is very rare. It's perfect if you just want to browse privately or bypass basic blocks. Now, the free version auto-connects you to the fastest available server, so if you need to manually pick a specific country, like for streaming, you will need their paid plan. This video is not sponsored by them, but I do have affiliate links in the description. If you start with the free version and then decide to upgrade later, I'll earn a small commission at no extra cost to you, and it helps to support the channel. Thanks for that. Now, back to the video. Now in this example today, I've got this laptop here, which still has a hard drive inside of it, and I'm going to be cloning it to this SSD. Now this SSD is only a 120 gig SSD, but it'll do the trick, and this is a SATA SSD. Now you also get NVMe drives or M.2 drives, and some laptops and desktops can take these drives, so it depends on what you're working with, but the process that I'm going to show you in this video will be the same for any form factor that you use, whether it's SATA or an NVMe drive. Now, for this process to work, you're going to need some sort of way to connect both of these drives to the computer at the same time. In my example here, I've got this SATA to USB 3 converter, so that I can plug the SATA SSD into this converter and then plug the USB into the laptop. That way, the internal drive is connected to the laptop and I can then connect the new SSD via USB. And once the cloning process has finished, then I'll just install the SSD into the laptop. Now, you also get USB to NVMe or M.2 converters. So like I said before, depending on which form factor you're working with, whether it's SATA or NVMe, you'll just need to buy the correct converter so you can connect both drives to your computer at the same time. If you're using a desktop, you can check if your motherboard already has connections for both drives. Usually you have multiple SATA connectors on a motherboard, and you can then easily connect multiple drives to a desktop. So let's jump into the actual disk cloning process. Now, the software that we're going to be using to do the disk clone is DiskGenius Free Edition, and you can download it for free from the DiskGenius website. Now, I'll also just mention that this video is not sponsored. This is just a good free software to use to do the disk cloning process. Now, I'll also include any links or commands that I use in this video in my written guide on my website, and you can find a link to that in the description down below. But once it's downloaded, you can just go through the DiskGenius setup wizard. It's really simple. You just click next, next, next until DiskGenius is installed on your computer. Once DiskGenius launches, this is the user interface that you should be seeing. Now, this might look overwhelming at first, but don't worry, we're only going to use one feature that the software has to offer, and I'll guide you through it step by step. But if we have a look at the user interface on the left here, we can see that I've only got one disk connected to this computer right now, which is HD0. Which is the hard drive that's physically inside of the laptop. So the next step is to connect the SSD that I'm going to clone to this computer. So I'm just going to grab the USB to SATA converter. Then I'm going to connect the SATA SSD to the ports on the USB to SATA converter, just like that. Now I'll just connect the USB cable from the converter to the laptop so that it then connects the SATA SSD that I have connected to the converter to the laptop. So now we're back in DiskGenius, and I can see that I've got two disks connected. I've got HD0 and then HD1, which is the SSD that I just connected. So to start the disk cloning process, there's actually two ways that you can go about this in DiskGenius. You've got this OS migration feature at the top here to migrate your operating system to another drive. But before we get to that, if you go to the Tools menu, at the bottom here, you're going to find a Clone Disk option as well as a Clone Partition option. So for normal disk-to-disk cloning, you can use the clone disk option, which is what I'm going to select here. And now I get to select the source disk. So the source disk is the one where all my files and windows are currently on, where it's currently saved. So in my case, it's the hard drive, which is local disk C. And we can also see that it has a Windows logo on that drive. So I'm going to select that, which is my source, and then click on OK. Now you'll see that DiskGenius prompts me and tells me that if I want to migrate the current system, so meaning the operating system, which is Windows, to the target disk and make that disk bootable, they recommend that I use the system migration function. And if I want to use the system migration function right now. So the system migration function is the correct one if you're cloning your operating system to another drive, which is exactly what I'm doing here. I'm cloning my Windows that's on the hard drive to a new SSD. So I'm going to select yes, and it will then open the OS migration feature. But I thought I'd show you the clone disk feature as well, so that you know if you just want to do a normal disk-to-disk clone without there being any operating system on that disk, you can just use the clone disk feature that's available in DiskGenius. But I've opened the OS migration again, and now we only get to select the target disk because DiskGenius already knows that the C drive is the source disk. Now, throughout this process, you are going to get these warnings telling you that all of the files and partitions on the target disk, the disk that you're cloning to, will be deleted. So make sure that the target disk that you're cloning to is empty and that there aren't any important files saved on it. In most cases, if you're buying a new SSD and cloning to that SSD, then there won't be any files on the target disk. But just be aware that any files or folders that's saved on the target disk will be deleted as part of the cloning process. So I'm just going to click on OK to continue. And then on the next screen, you can see the system migration settings. So we can see that the source disk is local disk C, which is the hard drive that's currently in the laptop. And then the destination disk is the SSD. Now, something you might notice here on the target disk, in the partition layout, it shows that the local disk C is only going to be 60 gigs after cloning. And then we've got this block of free space, which is 50.7 gigs. Now, if this is the same for you during the cloning process, what you'll need to do is just hover the cursor over the end of the local disk C partition, like I'm doing now. And you can then click on that and you can drag it all the way to the right so that it takes up all of the space that's available on that drive. Now, something important I also need to mention here is that you might notice that I'm cloning from a 1 terabyte hard drive to a 120 gig SSD. Now, I can do this because the actual amount of data that's saved on the 1 terabyte hard drive is less than 120 gigs. So the total size of the target disk doesn't necessarily have to match the total size of the source disk. The important thing to look at is the amount of used space on the source disk. So in my case, the amount of used space is probably like 60 gigs or something that's used on the 1 terabyte hard drive. And that's why I can clone it to the 120 gig SSD, because there will still be a lot of free space left. But to continue, the source disk and the target disk is correctly selected for me, and I've now allocated all of the free space on the target disk. So to continue, you can just leave all of the settings on default. It's important to have the prevent system from sleeping during execution to be checked. It is checked by default, but just double check it. And then once again, you'll get a warning telling you that all of the files on the target drive will be deleted. And I'm going to click on OK so that I can continue. Now, next you'll find this window where you'll have to select between a hot migration or to reboot to WinPE. Now, the general rule of thumb here for most of you will just be to use the hot migration feature if it's available in this window. If it's not available, then you will have to use the reboot to WinPE option. But if hot migration is available, just go ahead and use it. And that's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to click on hot migration, and that's then going to start creating a snapshot. And it's also then going to start the cloning process. So the time this takes to complete is going to depend on the amount of data that it has to clone over. But in my case, it was around 7 minutes that it took. You can see right now it says the remaining amount of time is about 5 minutes. and you'll just have to be patient with this and wait for it to complete. Once it's finished successfully, you'll see a message saying the system migration has been completed. You can then click on OK and on complete. And then just for a quick verification, you can open the File Explorer, open the other disk that's connected to the computer, and just have a look and see that all of the files are there and that they're present. I can see the Windows folder is here, the users folder, so it does look like this has completed successfully. From here, I'm going to go ahead and shut down the computer so that I can install the SSD into the laptop. If you're on a desktop, you might just have to reboot and change the boot order so it boots from the new SSD, or physically remove the old drive that you cloned from and just have the new drive connected. So right here, I just removed the back panel. I can see the hard drive right there that's installed currently. So I'm going to remove that and then install the SSD that I just cloned to. So I've just removed the hard drive from the computer and replaced it with the SSD. So the SSD is now installed. I can go ahead and take the back cover of this laptop, and I'm going to close back up this laptop and then start it up again. So I've just booted up the laptop again, and we can see that I am now using the SSD that I just cloned to, and everything is still here. I've got all of my programs installed, all of my files are still intact, and running on the SSD is much faster than the hard drive, I can tell you that. So that's great. The clone was successful and I am now using the SSD. But there are some things I always do after doing a Windows migration like this, and I suggest that you do them too. The first one is to create a restore point. So I'm just doing a search for create a restore point in Windows here. And once I open that, you'll see in the system properties window here that the local disk C protection is off. So we have to enable it. So I'm just going to select that local disk, then click on configure and turn on the system protection. About 9% or 10% of your disk is fine for system restore. Just go ahead and click on apply and then on OK. And now system protection is on, as we can see there. But now we still have to create a new restore point. So just click on create, and then we can give this restore point a name. And I'm just going to call mine after disk clone, and then click on create and let Windows create that restore point. Once it's done, you'll see the restore point was created successfully. If we then go into system restore and we look at our restore points, we can see that we have the after disk clone restore point there in Windows. And this is like a fallback just in case anything goes wrong after the clone, because what I have seen happen sometimes is the initial boot is fine, but when you restart your computer, sometimes it doesn't boot into Windows again. Now, these cases are rare, but they do happen. And if they do happen, then you always have the system restore point to go back to. Now, the next thing here, Windows should enable by default, but it's always good just to run the command just to be sure. And you can see the command on screen now, but I'll also include it in my written guide. And when you run this command, all it's going to do is allow trim operations on the SSD or on the storage device. And basically, trim operations is just something that keeps your SSD healthy over time so that the performance of it doesn't degrade over time. Now, while we're in PowerShell, you can also run the following command to download Winhance. And Winhance is the Windows enhancement utility that I developed, so I am a little biased. But if you run this command, you'll be able to choose between a normal install or a portable install. For this example, I'm just going to use a normal install, which will then download and install Winhance onto this computer. Now, you can use Winhance to install or uninstall any Windows apps and features or external software that's available in it. You can also apply various optimization settings for Windows in different categories or customize Windows to your liking. So if you've never heard of or used Winhance before, I highly recommend that you give it a try. Now you might be wondering, what about the old drive? If you're on a desktop, you can just leave it connected and just make sure that your PC doesn't boot from it anymore and that it actually boots from the new drive. But if you're on a laptop, you can use this same converter or a USB SATA enclosure like I have here to create a external drive for yourself. So the one that I used in this video is actually a 2.5-inch SATA external case, and I just put the old hard drive inside of the enclosure, and I can now use this as a backup or external storage. But whatever you do, do not wipe or format this drive for at least a week after you've done the cloning process, just in case something goes wrong with the new drive. You'll still have this as a backup, and you don't ever have to format this if you don't want to. You can keep it as a backup because it's almost like a snapshot in time of your computer and all the files that were on it before you did the clone to the new SSD or the new drive that you migrated to. But a good rule of thumb is to just leave it alone for about a week. If everything works well for the first week after you did the clone, then you should be good and you shouldn't be running into any issues. But that's it. If this video was helpful to you, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. I make videos like this every single week. And if you've never seen my video on how Winhance fixes Windows 11 and everything that's wrong with it, I highly recommend that you click on the video that's on screen now. But as always, I just want to give a special shout out to all of my YouTube members. Thanks so much for your support. I really appreciate it, and I'll talk to all of you guys soon.